Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Mark Frazier, a co-director of the India-China Institute, and it's my deepest honor to moderate this panel featuring contributors to our newly published edited volume, Constrained Expertise in India and China, Knowledge and Power in Policymaking, published by Amsterdam University Press and now available for purchase through Routledge. This is the second of two panels to celebrate this publication. The first panel being held last week, and which also, like tonight and today, is featuring 5 chapter authors who, in different ways, looked within the bureaucracy and the forms of expertise that the Indian and Chinese government deployed in various policy areas. So today's panel looks at the other side of the state-society pairing, at social movements, local knowledge, and local expertise in the shaping of public policy, and in some cases, resistance against incumbents and current policy. Before I turn to the authors, I'll say a brief word or two about the origins of this book. The India-China Institute sponsored a fellowship program in 2021 that brought together scholars and practitioners from a wide range of disciplinary and institutional settings in India, China, the United States, and Europe. We met online for several months with fellows presenting their research findings on the role of experts across a range of policy areas, including industrial policy, housing, technology, public health, among many others. And thanks to our co-sponsors at the Center on Asia and Globalization at the National University of Singapore, we held an in-person conference there in fall of 2022, at which draft chapters were presented and discussed. And the volume that resulted from that conference, the one we're talking about today and we talked about last week, the volume that resulted would not have been possible without the efforts, the tireless efforts of our authors, each of our 12 authors, and also the tireless efforts of our lead editor and my fellow ICI co-director, Manjari Mahajan, and also Dr. Yang Allen, of ICI at the time, who kept us on pace throughout the very laborious copy editing, proofreading, and indexing stages of production of the book. So many thanks to our 11 chapter authors, to Dr. Mahajan, and to Dr. Allen. Turning now to today's panel, we have 5 presentations that each in their own way reveal how local knowledge and practice, to greater and lesser extents, influenced policies related to urban waste management, rural development, palliative care, opposition to nuclear power, and COVID-19 responses. We will hear from each panelist, and I'll ask our audience throughout the presentations to please type your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll pose them to the panelists during the latter portion of the program. So our first speaker is Jaren Ergink, who is a research fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies. And I'll turn the floor now over to Jaren. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I'm happy to be here with this group of excellent scholars. Let me share my screen, and then I will be quickly talking about my chapter. Here we go. It should be all set, right? So my chapter is about expert participation in China's waste governance. But I am actually engaging with 2 sets of literature here. One set is the expert participation in policymaking in China, which is already a quite well-developed set of literature in itself. But I come from the background of participatory policymaking and deliberative democracy in China. So from this background, what I noticed in the literature on experts or state expert relations in China is a lack of definition of expertise with an awareness that the definition of an expert actually changes across issues and places in China's policymaking. I wanted to address this issue with a case study on waste governance in China to answer the question of how the definition of expertise, and of course, not only the definition in an isolated academic manner, but the political significance and legitimacy of the expert knowledge across the scales of government, central government, and various levels of local governments, and also across sectors or issue areas. And also historically across leadership periods too, because actually the biggest breaking point in the definition of expertise in participatory policymaking in China happens across the leadership periods, meaning from the Hu era to Xi era. So what we see is a shift from citizen participation to expert participation in policymaking in the Xi era, and hence the definition of who is an expert and who is not actually becomes a matter of exclusion and inclusion in the decision-making processes at the local levels, but definitely at the central level too. So this is the background, and to answer these questions, I use the broader literature on expertise that are not necessarily related to China, but like Eyal, Jill Eyal, and Ingram and Schneider, coming from an interpretative public policy background. And I identify different types of experts with almost on spectrum of political inclusion and relevance to the policy making. And the main takeaway is the formal expertise, like the academic expertise, the on-the-ground experience in different sectors, and policy advocacy or collective interest advocacy are called expert knowledge at different times, at different scales, and across different sectors in China, and they enjoyed a varying level of legitimacy, political legitimacy in the eyes of decision makers. I did fieldwork for that, and it was one of my best fieldwork experiences to work on this topic, I must say. I am still very moved and inspired by the scholars turned activists who advocated for the voiceless in the participatory policymaking in China. So there's this like personal touch about that too. But anyways, if I go into the topic, China's waste governance goes through different paradigms. And at each turn, at each paradigm change in waste management, we see an internal debate among the experts. But of course, the key point here is these experts come from different backgrounds. They are on the spectrum of the formal academic expertise, expertise that comes from experience in the sector, and expertise coming from public interest advocacy. So these paradigms, after the initial waste crisis in urban China with the rapid urbanization and industrialization, is from incineration, meaning burning the waste in plants outside of the second-tier cities, to a paradigm shift to recycling, thanks to the anti-incinerator activism of the grassroots stakeholders and citizens, but also activists, including scholars and non-scholars. And then in the second paradigm, recycling as an alternative to incineration, we also see an internal debate between primary recycling, secondary recycling, meaning recycling before or after consumption of the waste. Let me explain these two main debates in the waste management of China. The first one is about between incinerator and recycling, the burning the waste to produce energy, actually, but with serious environmental side effects, and recycling as a preemptive and sustainable solution or alternative to incineration. So this debate was mainly among experts based in the universities, but there are two types of scholars, academics involved in this debate. One side who supported the incinerator plants in the second-tier cities were actually an example of expert industry collusion because they were also majority stakeholders, owners of green sustainable solution private companies that were getting public tenders from the local governments. So they were actually wearing two hats to promote the incineration. Profits for their companies, but also a word in energy, China's energy transition, promoting a waste to energy model. The others, on the other hand, were pointing out the environmental hazards of the incinerators to the second-tier cities. And they were like the outsides of this expert local government industry triangle, and they were promoting the recycling one. So if we switch to the primary versus secondary recycling, that was a heated debate too, because and this debate was between experts based in the universities, the scholars who were against the incinerators, right? But now, in the second debate, in the shift to the second paradigm of recycling, they actually became, in a way, the conservative source closer to the state. Promoting community recycling by through middle-class mobilization, meaning setting up a recycling station in each compound in urban China and letting the urban citizens recycle their own waste. Whereas the more activist experts were promoting secondary recycling by migrant waste pickers or the companies later on either established by the migrant workers themselves or the local business elite, saying that the middle class compounds in urban China were not knowledgeable enough to know how to recycle. So what is most economically and environmentally sustainable was the secondary recycling done by the so-called lay experts, those without the formal training in recycling, but those who know by doing. But the voices of these waste pickers were silenced in the participatory policymaking scene of China because they didn't have the formal education, and they were coming from this socioeconomic class of migrant workers who tend to be excluded from the decisions about the cities anyways. So if I conclude my words, we can talk about 6 types of experts in participatory policymaking in China. And 4 of them have formal training in the issue areas, or at least in the fields adjacent to the issue areas. And some of them have formal employment in the universities. Those, the university professors with business links, the university industry collusion and local government collusion. The detached university professors who prefer to work with international organizations or domestic NGOs. Then the PhD activists who have the formal education, higher degrees, PhD degrees in environmental sustainability, for example. But they choose to work outside of the system in a way. They have a freelance relationship with the local government. They participate in public hearings and other deliberative democracy mechanisms, and try to amplify the voices of the voiceless, which are the lay experts without the formal or relevant training. And these PhD activists work with local governments or NGOs on an on and off basis, or sometimes they do have their own advocacy through WeChat and Weblogs and these kind of new media, new digital media. And the lay experts, again, as I said, some do have some political legitimacy thanks to their higher education, but most of them are the silent migrant workers who actually, I came to understand at the end of the day, the most knowledgeable ones about recycling in an environmental and economically sustainable way, yet we almost never hear from them. So this is basically the gist of my research, and the main takeaway of my research is the relationship between the nature of expertise on a spectrum from formal training and formal employment in an institution like a university or an NGO to the lack of formal training and formal employment in terms of the acceptability or the legitimacy of the expert knowledge produced, and receptiveness of the local and central governments of these different types of expert knowledge produced in China's waste governance. And with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm happy to discuss further on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Charan. Our next speaker is Kasaba Chandra Varagonda, a research fellow at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. Thank you, Kasaba.
Great, thanks very much. Well, I'll just start with thanking the New School and especially Profs. Manjari, Mark, and Grace for spearheading this project. Okay, I'll just proceed directly to my own chapter. Briefly, it's titled Challenging the Centralized Hierarchy of Civil Nuclear Policy and Expertise in India, Anti-Nuclear Opposition from the mid-2000s to late 2010s. I'm going to structure my presentation in 3 blocks. The first, I would just like to explain why civil nuclear policy in India is why I characterize it, and many others characterize it as a centralized hierarchy. That's because nuclear energy in itself is a very niche field, and it requires a high degree of expertise. So in India, that expertise is linked specifically to the state, as in the technocratic and bureaucratic officials associated with the state. There's no private company that does that undertakes nuclear power projects. It's entirely in the hands of the state. And the second aspect is that the state is legally and constitutionally allowed, or rather, the powers are vested within the central government, India's central government, to formulate and to carry out civil nuclear policy. And that is done in a hierarchical manner. The powers of the specific state governments are comparatively much lesser. The responsibility accorded to society to contribute to civil nuclear policy making is quite minimal, negligible almost. So in that sense, you see a bit of a pyramidical hierarchy. Central government up there, some responsibility and voice to the state government, and very minimal to the society. Um, and now my chapter really is, if this is how this sort of a pyramid is structured, how has society, through anti-nuclear opposition, challenged to a good extent successfully this sort of a hierarchy, right? Now on to the second block. I will be talking about social movements per se against nuclear power. I'll be within one specific period, that is the late 2000s to the late 2010s, right? Why this specific period? Because this was the time when the Indian government decided to embark on a very extensive expansion of their nuclear power projects. There were at least half a dozen new nuclear plants planned in several locations. I will be concentrating on three specific locations at different times to kind of give you an illustration of how this opposition has progressed. The first is Haripur. This is a region in West Bengal in India, where the Indian government decided to have a nuclear plant in the mid 2000s. So, in collaboration with Russia. Now, what happened was that the government went into the region of Haripur, which is comprised of villages, uh, most of them fishing villages along the Bay of Bengal coastline. And in response to this proposal, the largely the fishermen of those villages mounted an extensive protest. Uh, how did that happen? The first question is, why did they oppose the nuclear power plant? That has to do with their own identity as fisherfolk. What they were concerned about was the impact of the nuclear power plant on the coastal waters, and especially on the fish that they could catch and on their larger livelihoods. Um, they collaborated with many civil society activists and sort of the what do you call the science movement in West Bengal. This movement was a very dispersed civilian-led movement, rather than a scientist-led movement that sought to question established quote unquote established scientific norms, especially on nuclear energy. So they were concerned, especially after the Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island nuclear accidents, that nuclear power should not be the way to go. So in any case, the fisherfolk went in with two main what I would call as the politicization of the nuclear plant. Because the Indian government, according to the Indian government, the nuclear plant was essential for India's energy security. But the fisherfolk of Haripur said, well, it's not, because it might be harmful to us in the long run. If there's a Chernobyl-like accident, we'd all die. And the second is that it's harmful to our livelihood on an everyday basis. But we'd not be fisherfolk anymore, and then we'd be displaced. Where would we go? So this was what I would say was a challenge to the established expertise of the centralized hierarchy. And simultaneously, they undertook mass nonviolent mobilization against nuclear power, against the government officials. So what they did was they basically blockaded the village. So they didn't allow government officials to enter the proposed site. And the key blockade continued for 3 days, but then a symbolic blockade and continued protests went on for the next nearly 5 years. So it was a long haul protest. Um, so that was Haripur. Now I'll go to another site of contestation, which is Jaidapur. This is in the state of Maharashtra, right at the opposite coast. This is along the Arabian Sea. Again, it's the same thing. Fisher folk uh, in the villages around Jaidapur. Whereas the fisher folk in Haripur in West Bengal were largely Hindus of most of them of middle and lower caste. Uh, the fisher folk in Jaidapur were largely of the Muslim minority. Again, when the Indian government promulgated the nuclear power plant in Jaidapur, this was in about early 2010s. The largely Muslim fisher folk came up with the near exact concerns that the people of Haripur faced. One, livelihood. To them, it was like they were not just they had a cooperative, a fisheries cooperative, and they made a lot of money. And this was a ground up initiative on their own. So they said, well, you know, we know what we're doing. We've been fisher folk for generations. We know this business. And now you say you want a nuclear plant here, that would basically decimate our livelihoods. And keep in mind, Jaidapur, the government promulgated the plant especially after the Fukushima disaster. So that added an additional dimension to the protests, because they were like, well, if it could happen in Fukushima, it could happen here, and then this is a threat to our livelihoods, not just our livelihoods, but our lives itself. And they again mobilized against this nuclear this aspect of a nuclear plant in much the same way as the people of Haripur, except that in the case of Jaidapur, the protests, which were non-violent, were met with an excessive amount of police force. About 4 people died. And after that, the protests were turned into a bit of a clash between police and the people in the villages. But that again was one short blip in a very long haul opposition, which still continues today. I mean, it's not an active opposition, but it's a dormant opposition. Um, I'm gonna shift now to the late 2010s at another region. This is the Nallamala forests in the region of Telangana. This is near the city of Hyderabad, the forest. So and here it's not a nuclear power plant, but the government discovered a large reserve of uranium within the forest. So they wanted to kind of clear the forest to build a uranium mine. The only problem was that the forest was actually home to an indigenous tribal community, the Chenchu people. Excuse me. It was also home to a tiger reserve. So this was A, untapped virgin forest, B, home to an indigenous community, C, a tiger reserve, and D, to add to the mix, the water that was flowing to the city of Hyderabad came from the dams around this forest. And the city of Hyderabad is quite a megapolis now, economically. So this was when the government said we're going to have a uranium a uranium mine here, it would essentially involve clearing a large part of this fragile ecosystem. Now, what happened then was that the indigenous tribal communities passed passed their own directive because they had their independent village councils that were recognized by the Indian state constitutionally. So they passed a directive that there shouldn't be a uranium mine here. And then so far so normal in terms of protests, but then something greater happened, something that was rather unique in the annals of social movements in India up to then, which was that the urban public in Hyderabad took up the protests and they used the medium of social movements, social media, especially Twitter and Facebook. Now, Twitter is big, obviously, in India, but at that time, I'm talking about late 2010s, 2019 or so, it wasn't that big actually. And so when these urban middle classes kind of said, well, we want the virgin forests to be there. We don't want a uranium mine. It turned out to be a true middle class environmental activism, sort of an activism that you might see in mostly, say, Western countries, not so much in India, where the middle classes would be so collectively involved in activism for environmental for forests where they don't have as much skin in the game. And then you had film stars and celebrities also undertaking this social media activism, posting on Twitter and things like that. Now, these were again over here also. I just like to clarify, because when I say indigenous groups, there's often this misconception that they want to live in the forests alone. They don't want development. That's not true. Many of the Chenchu people, and especially in one famous video in which became viral on YouTube at that time, where one of the Chenchu tribal activists said, well, it's not that we don't want development. We do want development. What we want is for the government to help us modernize farming. And so I think you can sort of see that opposition to the centralized hierarchy has sort of comes from two different facets, right? One is the mobilization part, and the other is charting a different sort of an expertise. So I hope this has given you all some flavor, and I do look forward to questions to discuss further on this. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kesava. All right, our next speaker is Tracia Siu, a senior fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies in New Delhi. Welcome, Tracia.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everybody. Here it is in Kerala, it's evening. So it's heartening to be part of the teamwork on this book, Expertise, Knowledge, and Power in Policy Making in India and China, the two comparatively largest economies with growing population and varying economic and geopolitical roles in the contemporary global economy. So the time is, this critical time is very important for a discussion on policy issues and discussion on a book like this. Thank you very much, the New School team, Manjari, Mark, Grace, Young, and also all our fellows. My topic is shifting locations of knowledge production for health policies, community engagement in palliative care in the Indian state of Kerala. The study uses primary and secondary methods for data collection. Though the state's policy making and its knowledge production processes are analogous with the country's, palliative care policy development portray a different contour in knowledge production and formulation. Across globe, including in India and Kerala, by and large, health policy making is expertise oriented and derives from the power and knowledge of bureaucracy, medicine, and other state agencies. However, biomedicine's positive claims of objectivity and universality in health policy making often fail to accommodate the interlaced societal and individual experience of health. It ignores lay knowledge, people's imaginations and sufferings, and their socio-political and cultural context, and thus it becomes inevitably medicalized and individualized rather than collectivized and politicized. Despite this, historically, several studies since the 19th century contested this, emphasizing the role of politics and socio-economic and cultural factors shaping health and argued for inclusivity. However, such perspectives are largely shadowed by the biomedical supremacy. This is the larger health policy making context where our study is located and portraying a very different story with greater community engagement. Began in 1993 in a clinical mode with the support of community volunteers since the beginning, the palliative care movement palliative care initiative rapidly turned into a movement owned by community-based organizations providing home-based total care, particularly in northern parts of Kerala. The community-based organizations recasted the medicalized interventions into integrated support services that combine medical, physical, psychological, economic, and emotional services. Notably, the community ownership of the initiative enabled the CBOs, community-based organizations, to plan, design, implement, and monitor program, as well as mobilize resources, including for hiring medical expertise and providing economic, social, and rehabilitative care. All the interviews reiterates this point, interviews all the professionals and the participants reiterate this point. Owing to the overwhelming response of the community and the media coverage, several NGOs, state agencies, and people from different walks of life contributed to the expansion of palliative care services all over Kerala. And by 2008, for the first time in India, Kerala declared a pain and palliative care policy. What is intriguing in Kerala's palliative care policy formulation is that an engaged community's experiential expertise has occupied a focal place rather than the centrality of experts' knowledge. In this policy-making process, there was a departure from the hierarchical top-down conventional havens. Led by the experiential expertise of the community, collective knowledge production and policy formulation were ensued by networking between community-based organizations, professionals, government departments, particularly health and local self-government department, NGOs, bureaucrats, and politicians. In Kerala's changing landscape of knowledge creation for policies, palliative care policy making was interdisciplinary, reflective, and socially contextualized. And the recognition and collaboration extended by the local governance system enhanced accountability and authority of the movement. By 2012, the local self-government department made palliative care services mandatory for all healthcare institutions under it. What could have been some of the factors led to a PC movement with greater community engagement and co-production of knowledge for policy making, along with several other reasons? The social and political histories of the state with a rich heritage of public action may have influenced it. The democratization process enhanced the legacies of the social reform and political movements, and even during colonial political movements, even during colonial rule, may have provided the state a foundation for community engagement practices of palliative care initiative, as well as imbued it with a human right perspective. One of the critical challenges of this program is the exclusion of people on the margins, the Dalits and the indigenous populations and their experience. This remains a continuing public health and moral failure. The population have These populations have long histories of suffering and marginalization owing to the deeply ingrained structural inequalities and other embedded oppressive relations. Addressing social exclusion necessitates much more concerted political intervention. So the main takeaway is community ownership enables democratic decision-making processes, including resource mobilization. The resultant collective knowledge production ensures the centrality of the community's experiential expertise and facilitates a people-centered policy. However, when palliative care, including end-of-life care, is relocated to homes and communities, there is a real danger of transferring the responsibility of health from the state to people back home in a world and health sector marked by market logics, entrenched hierarchies, inequalities, and unequal power relations. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracia. All right, moving on. Our next speaker is Avinash Madhale, Program Director of Urban Programs at the Center for Environment Education in India. Avinash.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm glad that today I'm exactly in the place where we have done the case story on the response of COVID. I'll just put a few slides if I could just see if we can share it. Sorry. Is the screen visible to you?
Yes, it's visible. You might want to go to full screen share, full screen mode rather than slides.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm in this project. The case story we are talking about really the field action project. So this project is the case story is about coping with COVID with really a bottom-up approach with citizens' lay expertise. And the lay expertise also talking to the larger city context of how city is dealing with the pandemic situation. So the story is located in the marginal ward of Mumbai, that is MIST, which is very low in Human Development Index. And Tata Institute of Social Science, which was proponent of this project, was had been working in these informal settlements since year 2009. After the vulnerability index, the Human Development Index has ranked this ward. Mumbai is divided into 24 administrative ward, and this is one of those wards with lowest Human Development Index. Just to quickly show you how typically this ward looks like. It's a peripheral ward where also Tata Institute is located. And here we have also mapped, hence it was looked at as a health emergency, which is also a term which emerged with this COVID coming in. There was no executive emergency as well as the term of health emergency. If you say it's health emergency, then the implications are different. So even how system generates certain different terminologies to take or not take the responsibility is also quite an interesting segment when it came to declaring pandemic. Now, question is one of the most populated city in Asia, having a huge number of migrants at the same time, a lot of pressure on the systems. And Mumbai also was praised for being a Mumbai model. But all of this whole aspect of dealing with COVID, coping with COVID, there's also a challenge that how people also coped with it, with supporting each other with resilience. And that's the part we were trying to, I'm trying to really unfold. We also then, in the process of it, started mapping where are the health facilities are lacking in the primary, secondary, and tertiary sector. And this map kind of represents, which is also in the chapter, about the lack of services of this tertiary care and secondary care in the ward. When the COVID hit, MIST ward was also one of the wards which was more affected in terms of fatalities, but gradually the situation kind of changed. In the first wave, after the first wave of COVID, what was happening at the city level is, on one hand, you have, of course, not only change of power, but also the shift in the leadership at the city level. And here the paper argues about, apart from expertise, it is the trust network which also plays an important role in really defining the models and the procedures which would really fall in place, because it was also a bureaucracy-led process uh, where the citizen remains only a recipient or a, let's say, a spectator of what happens to their own lives in a sense, because it's a health challenge and it was a new challenge to deal with. At the same time, uh, the communities who do have fair and great understanding of their neighborhoods and the altruism to with its peak also try and really contribute to making things not only good for them, but community at large. And this is one of such examples of community kitchens which were set up in the community after lockdown was declared. One interesting analysis also shows here that if the government was also running a food distribution program, which was costing about 50 rupees per food plate, whereas the community-led process was 3 times lesser in terms of 17 rupees per plate is what the cost was coming to providing through a community kitchen mode. So some of these things were also fascinating in terms of looking at resilient model people do set up for themselves, even though you are in the most marginal area of the city. One interesting dimension which we also looked during this case story is why there is one model which is talked about in the in literature about Mumbai model of dealing with COVID, so the Dhabi model dealing with COVID, which is more dealt administration, whereas the MEST ward of dealing with COVID is more people centric, looking at the complexities and also challenges and less resources that are available with the communities which are in the margins. One of such thing during COVID was to really set up a mental health center, because so much of information was floating around. There's hardly information coming in on what kind of in terms of transport, when the railway is going to open, whether they're going to get ration or not, with the crowding to be done on a certain, like how to avoid crowding. A mental health line was set up here, and one of the aspects in the chapter we talk about really is just having a decent conversation with people with margins also gives a lot of hope to really cope with situation. And two communications I'm right now showing on the site here is about when people come even a COVID center, which is set up by government or set up by NGO process. There was a welcome note saying that nothing to worry. Here are some important things. If you really want us to do something at your home, can we send somebody? If there are particular things to be picked up from home, can we help you do that? So whole aspect of care is what came in as a core of the model to help communities which are already suffering from. The paper also 26,000 households is 100% census. But more than the data, the most important part for us was setting up a network of community resilient fellows who were picked up from community to do a tab-based data collection. But their responsibility was also to share the same data back to communities to make use of, in absence of there is no livelihood because of the lockdown, then what are the government schemes they can really get eligible for, because survey data also revealed the kind of documents required to do access to certain data. So these are examples of having, even in before second wave community mobilization, and also sharing data from surveys. There are
Hey,
also counter
Avinash,
maps.
sorry,
Yeah.
Avinash, we're on the second slide. Did you want, are you,
Oh,
are you meaning to advance the slides? I just wanted to check. Sorry.
okay, I'm sorry. No, I'm moving the slides and they're not moving.
Yes, we only
Is
see
the
the
counter map-
project, we only see slide number 2, project trajectory currently.
Oh my God. So I'm sorry, I was changing it, but anyway, let me maybe let me stop sharing it. But the data also the data sharing exercise was also done with community members to also get their inputs on what we found out that a lot of time different agencies do different kind of data collections, but what emerges out of that data in terms of knowledge usually doesn't get shared with communities. And here is an experiment which is done to also share data by the people who have collected the data from community, and that also built in a lot of trust in people. The other help which I mentioned in the paper is also about how the granular data of a community also useful for promotion of initially when the vaccine came in, there was no for vaccination because of several falsification or several myths associated with the vaccine. And here the use of this data of population which is more than people who are more than 45 years of age having comorbidities were identified through the survey data of about 1 lakh people which project has done, and sharing that data with government systems to also work closely with identifying individuals and convincing them to really come for vaccinations to also increase the herd immunity in a sense. What my core next component of this was also how do we also look at public food distribution systems, and the learning around that distribution system is how technology could be also integrated so that you can avoid crowding when it comes to people coming to collect their ration, which is the fair shop food distribution, which is supposed to be done through government systems. In nutshell, there are three clear arguments we are trying to make here. One is, in case of emergency, where there is definitely a medical expertise and medical advices are required, they do talk about certain mathematical modelings and certain behavior which is expected from people to be followed, trusting the medical expertise of people. At the same time, in marginal communities, when the precarious situation is much more higher, that behavior can't be just done by people, because it's also whether you die by COVID or die by hunger is the only choice people are left with. And such situation, resilience plays out much more greater role. A collective support and care, the process of bottom-up engagement of people, creating platform and sharing resources, trusting the ability of people to do good matters the most. That's one. Second, how data deficient our city systems are in terms of not having fairly granular details of data, which can really provide a community-led response, was quite evident into this process. And finally, I would say that what we really need to invest, looking at current learnings from it, will now be 5 years for the lockdown. We have also come back to a normalization or a new normal scenario. But at the same time, I always wonder whenever I'm in a East Ward that if a new form comes in, are we really ready to deal with the challenges? And are we really ready to trust people's intelligence and systems which can also save several lives if we just have some conscious care systems put in place into our governance mechanism? I'll stop here. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Avinash. Well, we're now at our final presentation from the panelists, and we remind the audience again to please prepare a question and put it in Q&A anytime. We'll turn to Yang Zhan, who is Associate Professor of Cultural Anthropology at Hong Kong Polytechnic University. All yours.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Mark, for the introduction. And I'm so happy to be here to share the research that I have done in Henan, China. And the title of my chapter in this book is called Gendering Scholar Activism in China's Rural Development. And the research actually started with a rather simple question or rather straightforward observation that I had in China. That is, usually the very important policy regarding China's rural transformation, or in Chinese it's called Sannong, like three agriculture problems. In this field, it's a really gendered field. Most of the policymakers and most of the professors and professionals who actually have a say in this field are male scholars. So that kind of puzzled me for a long time. So some people may say, it's mainly because these people, they are more actively engaged in this policymaking process. They have more experimental projects in rural China, so on and so forth. And I started to do some interviews and started to speak with a lot of NGO leaders. And I realized actually in China since actually for a long period of time, and especially if you were looking at recent development after the 1990s, China has a strong wave of rural development movement that is heavily intertwined with the gender and development movement. So in this process, female scholars, women in general, actually have a very, very important role, and they have done the heavy lifting in many places, and then they have started many different projects all over China. And it seems to me that there has been a gendered hierarchies of knowledge in the policy making processes. Some of the knowledge are made into the policy making apparatus, some are not, and this process is highly gendered. And if we push back to look at the history in modern China, it's very clear that the agrarian question or the rural question has always been framed as a national issue, which is not a coincidence that it's kind of a parallel with a lot of the discussion of nationalism, national development, and which has a similar kind of structure compared to kind of the patriarchal imagination, of the country, of the people. So my argument in this chapter is actually to show that female scholar activists, they actually produce very distinct, very interesting epistemology centered on care in the community, but this knowledge is systematically excluded from the formal policy-making channels due to this kind of marginalized position, but also this kind of dynamic within the state apparatus. And very interestingly, I was introduced to this village in China, in Henan. It's called Zhou Village. And in this village, two projects actually, they are happening at the same time. One is the very well-known state-led project called Beautiful Village Program, 美丽乡村. And this program in this small village has a massive budget, and it's focused on rural tourism. And they have spent a lot of money reconstruct a main road, and also to rebuild a lot of the buildings in and outside that village. And I had a chance to observe what kind of material they use. It's very interesting actually to save the money. Many of the buildings, the exterior tile, they were made of plastics, so it's very low quality and cheap material was used in this project, even though this was a very kind of a famous project. And in contrast, at the same time, there was this women scholar, female scholar / activist, Professor Liang, and she kind of put together a team in this village for 17 years already. But during that early 2020, she started to initiate this project called House of Dreams. And this project, this team, Liang's team actually adopt a very different approach to do the construction. For example, instead of focusing on the main road that leads to out migration, Liang's team actually focus on this small path within the village. And this idea is that instead of sending people to larger cities, they would like to focus on these small roads that help the children to go to school and help the elder women to travel to each other's house more easily. So this road later on they used recycled materials, and many of them they actually participated in this road construction as volunteer, and named the road later on as Road of Mutual Aid. And also, if we look at the material they use, instead of using the cheap new tiles, the plastic tiles, they actually they gathered a lot of the older materials, such as the old window frames and old wooden door, or old ceramics that they can find in their houses. They donate all the materials and they use these materials as inspiration and to make them to decorate, and also to weave together a community memories in their shared labor. And it's very clear that there are very kind of different concerns in these two projects. One probably focusing on this kind of a urban centered development. The other is more kind of leaning towards and focusing on the women's everyday life and so on and so forth. And again, not surprising, later on, because the House of Dreams, this project was so successful, it got a lot of attention within academia, and also it was recognized even by the local government. And then, very interestingly, they were recruited, as the exemplar of the governmental program, the Beautiful Village program. So in this process, there was this very strategic negotiation between the women and the government, because the women wants the program to last, to have continuous support from the government. But on the other hand, they are very clear that in order to have this recognition and support, they probably have to kind of give up this their name on this kind of project, right? This project no longer has its independent name, and this name was under this larger project, the state-led rural development projects. And in this process, from the outsider's perspective and also from the policy-making perspective, the women's knowledge, the local knowledge and local effort was very difficult to be channeled into the policy-making apparatus. So this was the observation that I had in this Henan village. So for me, this ethnographic story, this ethnographic observation actually echoes the very nationalistic and patriarchal kind of system in rural development for years. It can be traced back to the early 20th century. There were a lot of debates about this kind of lines, different lines of thoughts of where does China go and how do the rural villages fit into China's development. And this kind of debate continues. But still, what's also continues is this kind of omission or kind of there's a failure to recognize this kind of very interesting women-led development approach in this formal political sphere. So this is my main observation in this chapter, and I do think I have learned a lot from our fellows. So Thank you so much, everyone. I'll stop here. Mark?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Yang, and thanks to all of our panelists for 5 really terrific presentations. I think we can all see, those of us in the audience, those of us listening, how each of the presentations deals with the question of expertise in various ways that's outside established networks of government or institutional forms of, or institutional purveyors of knowledge. And I think also it shows, as we could see, each of you engaged in research methods, for want of a better term, that involved going to real places, talking to real people, spending time listening, carefully observing the communities that you were studying, and seeing that lay expertise, or seeing the ways in which knowledge, local knowledge, is produced, or counter forms of knowledge to established hierarchies of knowledge are brought to bear to influence, at the end of the day, to influence policy outcomes. So I thank each of you for that. Reminding the audience, and we're getting some questions in the Q&A box now, but before we go to audience questions, I invite Manjari Mahajan to step in and with a question. Manjari?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks to all the panelists for these really interesting presentations. I mean, I think as Mark pointed out, if the first panel was about different kinds of expertise that are embedded and more integral to the state, these are all examples of expertise that come from outside the state. So, you've used different terms like lay expertise, experiential expertise, participatory expertise, community expertise, citizen-based expertise. So there are different terms that different authors have used. I guess a question that I wanted to ask you was, what factors in your work were shown to be important for determining successful integration of participatory expertise into processes of policymaking? Because one of the interesting things about having your works from India and China juxtaposed against each other is that despite the obvious regime type difference between the two countries, both countries clearly have avenues for local participatory community-based expertise to be heard in policymaking processes. And both countries also clearly have hurdles. But I'm curious what you thought were important factors. I mean, some of you have mentioned trust, some of you have mentioned long-term relationships, but it would be good to hear from you.
Who would like to start? Sharon, you spoke first. Do you have a...
Sure. Yeah, that is actually a very core question to my research. There are different forms of expertise, and whose words are more legitimate in the eyes of the state, or states, in plural, like local states, central states, and regional differences, and all that. So I think my main takeaway is there's an unspoken and sometimes even spoken explicitly hierarchy of experts, and there are 2 factors that put you on top of the list. One is formal education, and second is your class backgrounds. Formal education puts you at the top because of also, like, historically, institutionally, the importance that China attaches to education, formal education, in the post, especially in the post-Maya era. But also, even if you lack the formal education or a formal affiliation with an education institution, if you are middle class, then you have a higher chance of being heard by the states than a migrant worker, for example. If you are white collar versus blue collar, for example. So there are these implicit hierarchies among experts.
Anyone else? Kesaba, you had you had the mention of the centralized hierarchy, and I'm wondering, as the protesters mobilized, is it, and you talked about the reasons that they invoked to oppose the nuclear plants, but um, was there also a kind of was there a type of expertise that they maybe there was an expertise in terms of developing patterns of protest and resistance to have these protests last longer than a few days. But what do you think about this question of the factors that helped influence the outcomes? And I guess at the end of the day, maybe because of time, we didn't. Was it clear whether the plants got at the end of the day were they actually built or postponed or canceled?
Great. Thanks very much for both Mark and Manjari's questions. I think I'll just be the pessimistic person and then let all the others take the optimism. So first, I'll just start with the question of were there alternative forms of expertise? Yes and no. Yes, in that the local communities basically stated that this is development according to us, whether it's the fisher folk or whether it's the indigenous people. And a nuclear plant is not there within the rubric of development that we see for ourselves. So that's a very localized form of expertise. No, in the sense that there was no alternative to, if not nuclear, to propel an industrialized country, then what? So that there was no answer. The second, in terms of what was the outcome, of all the three protests, they were, you could say, successful in their own way, in that there was no nuclear power plant built or a uranium mine presently. In fact, anti-nuclear protests have been successful to the extent that the Indian government has stepped back from putting in any new locations for nuclear plants. And the latest news this year is that they're going to concentrate on more smaller nuclear plants or nuclear reactors rather than the large scale plants that had been initially envisaged. So in that sense, you could say there was success, but I would contextualize it in that India is still very active in pursuing nuclear, civil nuclear development. And B is there has not been yet a formal channel to get the local voices and the voices of the public into the policy making sphere. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Any further thoughts? I do have a couple of questions in the Q&A box,
Yeah.
but Avinash.
Yeah, so I just reflecting on this whole angle of see credentialism for sure, but the credentialism when it is linked with geography, that what geography or which institution or what kind of an area you come from. In talking from our experience here, if youth who also have good credentials and good percentage, and if they write their address as they're staying in this Govandi or Mankur as an area where and what is located, their application for jobs get rejected. Now, because the inherent bias of the location uh, and the bias towards their ability and their expertise of whatever they are studying, whether it is engineering, whether it is be any other we seek a white collar or blue collar job, does have great level of impact on your future mobility. And therefore I feel that a lot of people change their address while they apply, so that's an adaptation strategy as well. So and then they say that when they get the job, and we don't know how to then react to that particular situation, whether you're trying to bring in an identity of of being proud of you coming from a very underprivileged background, but still you're fighting the battle. But then the complexities and the order becomes taller and taller. So that's one aspect of what we were briefly talking about, the credentialism and the link with expertise on one hand.
Okay, thanks. In the Q&A, oh, Teresia, please. Oh,
No, we can carry on, I mean, otherwise I'll just say a few words. Yes.
please go
Trust
ahead.
yeah, trust is very important, when ultimately the community-led palliative care movement and the policy, the community-led policy making, integrated to the public health policy realm, then the trust is very important, because people trusted the professionals and also the caregivers. And the kind of, and the, in fact, the community's ownership, that all the caregivers are the community people, and when they are the owners of that organization, and they are sharing within themselves and between the professionals and the community, they create a kind of, specific knowledge realm. So it's a combined effort. And when this enthusiasm from these people, when their felt needs are met to a certain extent, not just the clinical, but the economic, social, emotional, and needs like that. When it is met, people will be overwhelmed by that. And then the local governance system, they cannot ignore it. And of course, then the state agencies also cannot ignore such initiatives. So there was a kind of strong and deep trust relationship, plus the non-hierarchical way of the vertical and democracy in vertical and horizontal ways, that way of functioning ultimately led to the policy making. So in fact, the government is, maybe we can say that in a way it is, they're forced to take it, because it is in all parts of the state and across sections of the community. Of course, there are exclusions, but still, by and large, it is well received. So in that case, but with one more point, I'll just end this. In Kerala's case, our legacy is slightly different. Unless and until we have a kind of like at least primary educated community or even secondary educated community, and also the politicization experience had gone through, so that is very important. So in that context, only these kind of cohesiveness and these kinds of movements take place. Otherwise, it won't be that democratic and non-hegemonic. Not hegemony, but it is non-hierarchical. So that context is very important, So I think in this community engagement processes, which leads to the policy initiatives, are much more rooted in communities where such politicization and democratization has happened. Thank you.
Can I just come in, Mark, very quickly? So I think the overall trend across the 11 chapters of this volume was that despite different contours, there is an overall trend of shrinking spaces for participatory local expertise, especially if it is oppositional or dissident in nature. But despite that overall trend, I think the two chapters that in some ways provided the most interesting, optimistic examples of how local participatory community involvement could shape policy were from Tresia's chapter and Avinash's chapter, right? And it seemed as though the variables that seemed really important as to how their various institutions, actors managed to become influential in shaping policy was, Tresia, as you're mentioning, this aspect of trust, this aspect of long-standing relationships between community institutions, whether they be universities or think tanks or activist organizations with governments and the community, and this larger history of kind of having movements and politicization as an accepted part of democratic or general politics and governance in a place. But I know there are questions in the Q&A box, so I'll stop there.
Okay, and we have questions in the Q&A box indeed, and they happen to come from our fellow contributors who were on the panel last week. So you, Joe, who did have to leave a bit early and isn't on the call right now, but she's asking a question to Charan about the buzz lately in China that the local authorities have run out of trash to burn because they've overbuilt incinerators. So she's saying some cities even have to dig out their old trash from landfill, I suppose, in order to incinerate it. This situation, Yu says, made the recycling activists hard to get public support. And she is wondering whether you, Taryn, have seen this situation also. And then can I just add another one, because we have another fellow chapter author, Lorraine Kennedy, who also has a question for Taryn about Chinese authorities. Were they influenced by global debates on waste management? Did you find evidence that there were international organizations involved in some of the paradigm shifts that you observed? And then I have a question for Jianyang after Taryn has answered.
Thank you. Yeah, excellent questions. For the global debates, if I go the reverse order, yes, the authorities were well informed by them, thanks to the experts. Most of the experts I've talked to were very well engaged, even like directly engaged with their counterparts internationally. Some of the university professors or those working in NGOs, with or without a PhD, they had connections with international environmental NGOs and research institutes and whatnot. So they were actually in close connection with that, and they brought in the knowledge and even sometimes like people to discuss recycling versus incineration and sustainability versus energy production, energy transition, because they wanted to really weigh in on environmental protection versus energy transition debates. It's a debate difficult to win in China. So they actually wanted to be armed by their international connections in this debate. So they actually, yes, intentionally brought in this international knowledge and networks into the conversation. So the global debates are very much a part of the discussion in China. But there's also a good point about like going back to Manjari's previous question, like what's brings you the legitimacy, what makes you heard in the debates, in the policy debates, right? So bringing in the international networks, of course, can go both ways, right? Like you can be also perceived as a foreign agent or something, but it can also strengthen your arguments too. Like if you bring foreign experts on the topic too. So that's what they were trying to do. Successful at times, not successful at other times, but that was the intention to actually increase their legitimacy. For the other Yudro's question about not finding enough waste to burn, because there are now too many incinerator plants. I mean, it made me smile because it is, again, the overcapacity problem, right? It is directly related to how Chinese industrial policymaking is implemented at the local level. The central government has this idea, but leaves it to the local governments to plan the development of a certain sector, and the local governments just go to town with it. And then you get overcapacity in pretty much all the sectors, and it's no surprise that it's happening in the incinerator plants as well. That actually is related to one of the aspects of my research, like how some experts were, university professors were directly linked to the business. They were advocating for the incinerator plants because they had shares in these companies. And that goes one step back to the fact that this environmentalism and sustainability used to be a public interest advocacy issue in the 90s and early 2000s in China. And the environmentalist NGOs were the first ones to be politically constrained and suppressed and everything. But then there was a sea change that they were the environmental sector, sustainability sector became a part of, it was marketized. It became a part of business profitability. And a lot of environmental NGOs actually registered as sustainability companies, private companies. But then all these sustainability solutions became a part of the market demands. And when it's a part of market demand, then you have this overcapacity of incinerator plants. Hence, the difficult position the recycling activists find themselves. Yeah, excellent point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then I think we have time for a final question to John Young, also posed from Lorraine Kennedy. John, did these women scholars express awareness that their knowledge, methods, materials were linked to gender sensibilities? So were they aware of that? Or was it just a case of being different from more mainstream practices? Do you know if they were also involved in feminist gender equality movements?
Thank you very much, Laurie, for this question. I would say the key person, like the leader of these projects, they are very aware of their role in this kind of a feminist movements, because many of them, they were influenced by the earlier women scholars in or out of the Chinese state. So I'm not sure whether you're aware, there was this very strong movement, the feminist movement within the Chinese state. Some scholar would call it a state feminist movement in China in the early 30s and 40s. So many of them, these women, they were influenced by that, and they are also part of this China Women's Federation, which is the state, part of the state apparatus, I would say. So the leaders are very aware of the feminist tradition. But a lot of the local women, the rural women, they, at the beginning, very beginning, they weren't quite aware of this feminist aspect. But after years and years of negotiation and conversation, many of them, they acquire a different position within the village and within their families. And they start to realize this is about women, this is about women's life and women's status. So I would say this kind of process is a very ongoing negotiation. And this also speaks back to Mark's earlier question, that expertise. I think in my case, when I think about expertise, it does not belong to one person. Sometimes it's a very collective effort. And in China, it's very interesting for the state usually recognize models, right? Some project as models, and usually these models does not really belong to one person. It's a collective effort, and then the state usually promote these model to other places, and that's how some of the knowledge and expertise made into this policy making processes. Yeah, I hope this answers your question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And with that, let me just say to the audience thank you for joining us here for this panel discussion. The video of today's conversation will be available on the India-China website in a short time. And the video from the October 23rd, last week's panel, is already on the India-China Institute website in case you were not able to attend that one. I want to say a special word of thanks to Grace Ho and our team at the India-China Institute, and to Michael Shaw, the New School's IT Events Manager. And with that, the panel is concluded, and thank everyone again. Goodbye. And can I ask the panelists if they have time to hang around a bit? We can chat once the audience has left the room.